Greetings, honored brothers and sisters. I would like to begin my speech by giving thanks to Allah for allowing us to be gathered here and for His love and the love of His Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. And for the love of the Ahlul Bayt. And I would like to thank you all here for coming to tonight's program for the Fatimiya nights. Today I will do a brief discussion of Amir al-Mu'mineen, not just as an Imam or a warrior or even as one of God's most beloved creations, but also as a lawgiver and a source of justice in this world. In our Western world, the legal system that binds Western societies is one that has developed over preceding centuries through a never-ending cycle of social changes and philosophical shifts. From the 12 tables of Roman law to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, the laws of Western countries, for all their specific differences, are united by a series of shared assumptions about the nature of justice and order. These assumptions can take the form of overarching concepts such as the rule of law and the supremacy of constitutional power, human rights, etc., to more specific legal norms and presumptions. For example, the presumption of innocence in criminal trials, or certain evidentiary rules on hearsay and privilege. These legal norms form the bedrock of Western legal traditions and are the basis today by which all other societies and legal systems are judged. These societies, those societies which do not subscribe to these principles or which disregard and ignore them in practice are often attacked by Western legal scholars, academics, and advocates as unjust, inefficient systems. In recent years, unfortunately, some scholars have attacked Islamic legal traditions by arguing that these traditions fail to adhere to the norms and principles of justice which underpin legal traditions in Western countries. And perhaps to some extent, when we look at the laws that are enacted and practiced in many Muslim countries, such concerns are somewhat perhaps warranted. Yet when we assess the justice by practice by Imam Ali ibn Abi Talib, peace be upon him, what we see is that, in fact, Islamic legal traditions not only subscribe to Western traditions, but in fact predate and build upon them. In the 25 years that Imam Ali was sitting behind the scenes of the Khalifa of Umar and Abu Bakr, and in the 5 years that Imam Ali ruled the Khalifa, what we see is an attempt and perhaps success by the Imam to lay down overarching principles and specific legal rules, explicitly and implicitly, which are analogous to modern Western norms and perhaps in some ways even go beyond them in establishing justice and order. To begin, we can start by looking at the overall perception of justice advocated by the Imam. In Western traditions, the concept of justice is one that is seen as an objective determination which can be reached through sufficient diligence and growth in our own perception of right and wrong. The search for justice is linear. As societies move forward technologically, culturally, and socially, their understanding of what is just and what is fair in this world also grows. The purpose of justice is not utilitarian, i.e. maximizing the most good for the most people. Rather, it is focused on securing as much the rights of the individual as much as it is focused on securing the well-being of the community. Any policy or judgment which disadvantages a single individual for the benefit of the whole cannot be considered just under modern conceptions of justice. Today, to us, this might seem self-explanatory. Anyone that has any understanding of modern philosophies and ideas of justice would think that this is pretty taken for granted. Yet, historically, as we have seen, this is not always the case. The famous Greek philosopher Plato, for example, provided a conception of justice which was largely utilitarian and instead favored a world where justice was assured when the individual limited his interests to the position in society he was destined to inherit. If you were destined to be a worker or a farmhand, justice was that you remained a farmhand and you never tried to rise above your station. In such a society, justice was merely an illusion created by the ruling classes, and an individual who seeks to advance his own interests and station in life undermines the fabric of the whole and therefore commits injustice against nature and his society. This is a perception of justice which is quite prevalent in Marxist, fascist, and even some so-called Islamic worldviews. As people of the 21st century, We have, of course, seen how the Platonic theory of justice has led to tremendous suffering and naked injustice for the people of such societies. Yet when we look at Imam Ali, peace be upon him, we see his recognition of the dangers of utilitarian justice. We see how he lays down the correct perception of Islamic justice. In Nahjul Balagha, it is narrated that Imam Ali was asked if generosity is better than justice, to which he replied with the following: "Justice is a universal path, while generosity is a particular case. Hence, justice is the superior and the nobler of the two." In another sermon, he elaborates in a beautiful statement: "He who finds justice restricting will surely find oppression much more restricting." From this narration, what we see is an endorsement for the objective perception of justice. Justice is a standard that must be achieved by civilized societies rather than a construct of the ruling class. Furthermore, what we also see is a tempering of many of the altruist principles which temper other theories of justice. Altruism asserts that public good is achieved through selflessness, that individuals should sacrifice their personal good for the well-being of others. On an individual level, the value of altruism is undeniable. Giving and generosity are praised in Islam as valued virtues, and Allah will question all of us on the Day of Judgment on our generosity to those that need generosity. However, the embrace of altruism as a form of justice is unrealistic, as it requires people to be selfless. And though we may all ask ourselves and others to be selfless, what we know is that in practice, individuals are more complicated than that. Any system of governance where the less fortunate are protected through the grace, kindness, and generosity of the ruling class is a system that is inherently unstable, as it is simply too easy for those less fortunate to be neglected and oppressed. With Imam Ali, we see his recognition that though generosity is a praiseworthy virtue, it is not a realistic one to govern an entire society. In Canada, for example, we do not rely on the grace of the virtuous altruist to protect the rights of minorities and the economically deprived. Rather, we have a charter which guarantees the rights to all people within Canada. We have ameliorative government schemes to provide income assistance, free health care, and legal aid. Canadian law, especially in the realm of commerce, has steadily moved away from the laissez-faire, anything goes principles of buyer beware, which underpin commercial and labor contracts, to principles which codify fairness and seek to prevent abuses of bargaining power, fraud, and misrepresentations. To give an example, labor law in many Western countries was governed by this laissez-faire principle that you get what you pay for. And if you want better living conditions, it's only because your employer feels like giving you those living conditions. Obviously, we've moved away from that by codifying that in law. Yet 14 centuries ago, we see Imam Ali recognizing the inherent danger in a system based on generosity, where Western legal traditions have only moved towards codifying these principles in the last 50, 40 years. What we see is over 1,000 years ago, Imam Ali saw the danger in prioritizing generosity over justice. Justice, as articulated by Imam Ali, is a universal standard which can be held to all individuals, regardless of their personal views about generosity. When justice is established as an objective standard, it is much more difficult to undermine. Furthermore, justice cannot be compromised for the sake of utility and convenience, again, as we see in the teachings and the sayings of Imam Ali. To give a Western example, in criminal law, there are many protections that are afforded to the accused. And this is because of the great penalty that underpins criminal offenses. So courts have repeatedly said that simply because it is easier for the prosecution to establish their case, that does not justify undermining these protections. Justice cannot be undermined for the sake of convenience. Again, we see 14 centuries ago in Nahjul Balagha, Imam Ali beautifully articulates this principle. We see how in the lead up to the wars with Muawiyah, the threat of another fitna led many of the Imam's well-meaning companions to suggest that perhaps his reforms, his pursuit of justice in the Islamic Ummah should be slowed down and relaxed and perhaps foregone in the pursuit of peace in the Ummah. They argued that by by slowing down the pursuit of justice, there would be greater good in peace. After all, in peace, we don't see people killed on battlefields. We don't see lands ravaged by armies. But Imam Ali understood that to compromise on justice today is to undermine and destroy the very integrity of the ummah. If justice is not protected, then what is this ummah that these companions are arguing we should save, in their, of course, well-meaning intent? The Imam provides a beautiful reply to these companions who ask that perhaps the pursuit of justice should be relaxed. He says, "Do you really ask me to seek support through injustice? By Allah, I will not do it as long as the world lasts and one star follows another in the sky. Even if it were my own property, I would distribute it with justice." What we see is a perfect conception of the idea underpinning contemporary discussions on the topic. Justice must never be compromised on. However, the conception of justice on its own is only half the struggle. Justice must also be paired with the rule of law. To describe what the rule of law is a difficult concept, and we could be here for days trying to grasp what it is. So it is easier to describe rule of law by what to see to understand if it is present or not. The World Justice Project states that the rule of law has 4 key aspects: accountability, just laws, open government, and accessible and impartial dispute resolution, i.e. courts. When we assess Imam Ali's justice and his government, what we see is that all 4 of these principles were articulated and practiced by Imam Ali. The essence of accountability is that the rulers are accountable to the ruled, that they cannot simply exercise their powers arbitrarily to their own personal gain, but rather to the benefit of their constituents. Furthermore, accountability requires that when the ruler fails to exercise those powers appropriately, the ruled have recourse to demand answers and enforce sanctions against their rulers. So if the ruler only enriches himself at the expense of his people, the people have a means to hold him to account, and if necessary, to remove him from power. When we read Imam Ali's teachings, we see a fundamental appreciation of accountability. Again, in Nahj al-Balagha, Imam Ali describes the rights of rulers over their subjects as a reciprocal duty, with similar rights of the subjects over their rulers. So the rulers will have rights over their subjects, but their rights are not absolute. If they abuse their powers, their subjects have the right over their rulers. And if the rulers does not respect those rights, then he has to answer to Allah. Imam Ali repeatedly speaks of how the unjust shedding of blood and the unjust enrichment of rulers at the expense of their constituents will be punished gravely by Allah on the Day of Judgment. Similarly, upon his accession to the Khalifa, Imam Ali began his reign by promising to return the funds that were stolen from the Muslim treasury by the preceding administration. What we see is a clear understanding from the Imam that state funds are not the personal wallet of the state's rulers, which was something very unprecedented for the societies that were contemporary to the Islamic Empire. Oftentimes, the state treasury, the taxes that were extracted from the people were nothing more than the king's own bank account to build and use as he pleases. But what Imam Ali recognizes is that the money that I take from my people is not money that I use for myself. It is money that I use for them. I am the trustee to my people. And again, as we see, Imam Ali holds the preceding administration to account. He states that he will stop at nothing in Nahj al-Balagha to repatriate every dirham that was embezzled from the people. And in the same narration, Imam Ali clearly states that there is a wide scope and room in the dispensation of justice. And what he says, when we translate it to language that is more familiar perhaps to scholars today, is that no one is above the law. In essence, to Imam Ali, clan, tribe, status, position in life are all meaningless when dispensing justice. And these are ideas that were unprecedented for his time. The accountability that he demands from other administrations, he also demands from his own. In his famous letter to Malik al-Ashtar upon his appointment to governor of Egypt, Imam Ali warns Malik to check his desires and passions upon assuming office. He warns Malik to remind himself of the glory of Allah and to humble himself by remembering that Allah watches his actions. Imam Ali reminds Malik to do justice towards the people, against himself and his personal associates. Imam Ali implores Malik to contain passions and to check his heart from doing anything oppressive or contrary to the rulings of Allah. What we see thus is a set of instructions and a warning to those who are delegated power by Imam Ali. It is particularly noteworthy how Imam Ali emphasizes Allah's supremacy over man and all rulers. As the law of Islam comes from Allah, the law of Islam is Allah. And by emphasizing that Allah is always supreme, Imam Ali emphasizes that Allah's law is also supreme, that even a Khalifa or his governors or administrators or other officials are bound by Allah's laws. If we frame the discussion as one of law, what we see is a conception of rule of law, accountability and supremacy of the law that is quite natural to Western legal traditions. What we see is contrary to what would be practiced in Greek, Roman, and Persian societies, as a system where establishment of justice is not a discretionary activity of the ruler that the ruler may enact when he feels, but a requirement for the sovereign by law. It is a rejection of the despotic absolutism which had plagued non-Islamic and even Islamic society up to this point, a conception that would not be challenged in Western society until the signing of the Magna Carta in 1215 and the birth of constitutionalism almost 1,000 years later. Imam Ali lays down the simple proposition, no one is above the law, and he does so beautifully and eloquently, and in a time when this idea would be so alien to the ruled and to the rulers in any society of the world. For Imam Ali, the pursuit of political office is not the end itself. It is merely a means by which an individual or group of individuals can establish justice in their community. In that sense, power should not be hoarded for the sake of power. But Imam Ali does not stop there. In the same beautifully written letter, Imam Ali also tackles the second part of rule of law, which is that laws must be fair. Fairness as defined by the World Justice Project requires that laws are just, applied evenly across all people, and which protects certain fundamental rights such as the right to liberty, freedom of thought, religion, property, and other core human rights. In his letter to Malik al-Ashtar, Imam Ali articulates that rulings by Malik and his subordinates should favor the common people over the rich and powerful. Imam Ali establishes that for the law to be fair, it must not favor those with the means to advance their interests over those that do not. Justice accounts for the fact that one party is economically, socially, and politically better off compared to the other party. Imam Ali, in line with Islamic teachings, articulates the role of the ruler as the trustee of the people. He demonstrates his respect for human rights by instructing Malik not to hinder the lives of his subjects. Despite the fact that Egypt was largely non-Muslim and non-Arab in its composition, Imam Ali instructs Malik to respect the customs of the locals, to not discontinue their good lives in which the earlier people of this community had been acting, and only to intervene to improve their lives. Imam Ali provides further guidance on executive officers who implement Malik's laws, requiring that they be tested and appointed impartially based on their merit and virtue, but that they should also be watched and held to account for any potential malfeasance. He instructs Malik to be merciful with the people of Egypt, to look past transgressions, and to ensure that any laws enacted over them are fair and do not unnecessarily prejudice their rights. The result is a conception of laws which are not only fair, but are implemented fairly in the context of a 7th century pre-industrial society. Imam Ali's teachings also touch on the third aspect of rule of law, which is the idea of an open government. An open government requires that the processes by which laws are enacted, administered, and enforced are accessible, fair, and efficient. In the same letter, Imam Ali discusses his above-mentioned recommendations for appointing executive officers and counselors. He instructs Malik to surround himself with competent, candid counsel and to only appoint virtuous, tested officers. Imam Ali instructs Malik to not isolate himself from his subjects, to always be available and accessible to the people most affected by his policies. Imam Ali also discusses the appointment of clerical staff and secretarial workers. He instructs that those who are non-negligent and honest and who have the best reputation among the people should be appointed. In this sense, appointments should be granted based on what is approved, most approved by the people, and what is thus best for the people. You should not appoint subordinates who will only support his agenda, but rather people who have the trust and the faith of the community that they represent. And what we see thus is a command by Imam Ali that the instruments of governance remain transparent and accessible to the people. His requirements that senior officials be well paid to avoid bribery and excuses cements the importance of administrative efficiency, and his command to look after the lowest rung of society to ensure that no one is left behind by the laws of Islam. Finally, Imam Ali establishes the last component of rule of law, which is a fair and impartial dispute mechanism. This requires that justice be delivered in an ethical, competent, and independent manner by representatives who embody these virtues, who are neutral to the disputes being waged and possess the resources to do their jobs and reflect the community they serve. This is assured by Imam Ali's instruction on the appointment of judges and court officials. Similar to executive officers, Imam Ali instructs Malik to appoint virtuous, honest judges from among his constituents who can demonstrate impartiality and a lack of greed, judges who value the truth and reason, who are patient with litigants, considerate of arguments. He instructs that such judges should be paid well so that they have no excuses to avoid listening to complaints and litigants. Imam Ali even establishes an appeals mechanism so that potentially unfair rulings can be checked by Malik to ensure that they comply with Allah's justice. The result is a perception of a court system very similar to our own today, guided by many of the principles which underpin our own court systems. It is fair to say that Imam Ali's letter to Malik al-Ashtar, along with the Holy Quran, is the Ummah's constitution. When we analyze this constitution along with the other teachings of the Prophet ﷺ, Hazrat Fatimiyya, peace be upon her, and our Imams, peace be upon them, what we see is that in fact, Islamic law actively promotes the ideas of rule of law and good governance which define developed societies. The criticisms which are levied against Islamic law and against Islam as being incompatible with Western legal traditions is questionable and an untrue set of criticisms. The conceptions of law that we see in most Muslim countries today are not laws which can be said to be compatible with true Islamic legal doctrine or justice. The problem then lies not with Islamic law, as Amir al-Mu'mineen has already provided us with a legal framework which safeguards justice, but rather with Muslims who have failed to embrace and implement this framework. And with that, I end this brief discussion of law and justice in the context of Amir al-Mu'mineen. And I thank you all for coming here today. And I ask for forgiveness from Allah and for you for any shortcomings with my speech. Thank you. Ya Fatimiya.